Taxation without representation.
Taxation without representation. No taxation without representation is a slogan that started in the American Revolution. The American colonists believed that they should not be taxed by British Parliament if they didn't have anybody to represent them in the Parliament. It was the main grievance between American colonies and Britain because they had no voice in the government that was in control of them.
What is taxation without representation? After the 7 Years' War, the British found themselves in extreme debt and believed the fair solution would be to have the colonies pay it back. These taxes, such as the Stamp, Tea, and Townshend Acts, forced the colonists to pay taxes on most goods they received. No colony representation was allowed or taken into account, leading to the famous phrase, "No taxation without representation" by James Otis.
Where did taxation without representation come from? The phrase "no taxation without representation" came from a political activist at the time, James Otis. He was one of the most important speakers and defenders of liberty in the 1760s, while his voice was used to inspire others. Otis was in close contact with John Adams and many other important figures. The fight against unfair taxation can be credited much to Otis for his revolutionary phrase.
Stamp Act. In 1765, the Stamp Act was passed by the British Parliament to help repay debt caused by the 7 Years' War. This became the first tax imposed by the British, and it forced the colonists to pay a tax on common items like playing cards, newspapers, and documents. It was a direct tax from the British Parliament without acceptance from the colonists. The taxes had to be paid for with British money, and they refused to take colonial paper money. The British Parliament genuinely thought that this tax was fair.
Acts and taxes. All were either taxes or restrictions placed onto the colonies. The Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, the Tea Act, the Navigation Acts, Wool Act, Hat Act, the Proclamation of 1763, the Quartering Act, the Townshend Act, and the Coercive Intolerable Acts.
Why the colonists hated taxation without representation. The main reason that most colonists were angry was because Britain declined to give them a voice in anything. The second reason was the colonists were used to their freedom of living the way they had been, without much interference, and that had been taken away almost all at once.
How they fought it. As we said in the earlier slides, the colonists did not want to pay these taxes because they were passed by Parliament rather than their colonial governments. The colonists began to fight back by not buying British goods, harassing stamp agents, customs workers, and occasionally royal governors. Sometimes the protests were peaceful, like simply not buying British goods, or they would turn into riots and attacks. Sometimes it would even lead into property damage. One of the biggest protests during this time was the Boston Tea Party. The Boston Tea Party, after the frustration of the unfair taxation continued to build in the colonies, on December 17, 1773, over 300 chests of British tea were dumped into the Boston harbor. This was meant to revolt against the Tea Act by destroying nearly $18,000 in British goods, and this became the first real act that showed the British the colonists would not willingly take these oppressions.
The Boston Massacre happened on March 5, 1770. It started off as just a fight between a few American colonists and one soldier. Then more British soldiers joined and opened fire into the mob of colonists. It quickly turned into a deadly riot. Before the Boston Massacre happened, the British passed multiple new taxes onto the colonies on tea, glass, paper, paint, lead, etc. It started as a small fight and it soon became the turning point in the beginning of the American Revolution. Declaration of Independence. Although the Declaration of Independence was written for various reasons of freedom, taxation without representation was one of them. It became the final announcement to the king that control from overseas, such as the taxation on the colonies, would no longer happen, as it was now an independent nation.
The end.